Welcome to Unit 4, Deciphering the Earth's History. This lecture on Chapter 11 of your text will cover material relating to geologic time. Unit 4 is a relatively short unit. It's only comprises two chapters, chapters 11 and 12. Geologic time is the first, and the second is Earth history, basically an entire course compressed into one chapter. We're going to be moving through 4.5 billion years of Earth history in the space of 40 pages or so. But first, before we get to the actual story of the Earth, the actual historical record or what has happened on the Earth since its formation, we first need to talk about fundamental geologic principles that allow Earth system scientists to interpret it. So, the advent of modern geology. Nicholas Steno was one of the earliest scientists to record observations that were definitively geologic in nature. Some earlier scientists, Leonardo da Vinci in particular, have documented observations that were also geological in nature, paleontological in nature. But Steno was one of the first to lay down two fundamental ideas. One is the law of superposition, and that is simply states that in sedimentary strata, rocks that are on top of other rocks are necessarily younger, unless they've been overturned, of course. But Steno was fundamentally just stating that rocks are laid down in succession, and that rocks lower down in a stratigraphic sequence are older, and rocks that are higher up in the stratigraphic sequence are younger. The other thing that Steno contributed to geology is the principle of original horizontality, and that is again pretty intuitive now, but back then it was quite useful to scientists. And that is that sedimentary rocks are deposited in horizontal beds, and that is due to gravity, which he didn't really explain, but his this principle was based on observations. James Hutton, often credited with being the father of modern geology, published a work called The Theory of the Earth in 1788, where he defined this principle of, or a concept of what is now known as uniformitarianism. Geologists often rephrase this into the phrase, "the present is the key to the past." What uniformitarianism states or implies is that processes that shape the Earth's surface and that shape the Earth are, for the most part, gradual, predictable, and act over time scales in similar magnitude and breadth. That is, things that are happening now geologically are the same things that are happening or that happened throughout the entirety of the Earth's existence. Uniformitarianism was in direct contrast to the prevailing thinking of the day that was really centered around the notion of catastrophic events, or catastrophism is what it was called, but that catastrophic events, very rapid, high magnitude events, are what actually shaped the Earth's surface. Things like floods, earthquakes, volcanic activity, whether there was supernatural or not supernatural underlying cause to these catastrophic events is kind of beside the point. Oftentimes people assume that it was a fairly deistic or theistic kind of way of looking at the world that was challenged by Hutton. However, others would argue that really the notion that short-lived but high-intensity events were the dominant forces that shaped the Earth was supplanted by Hutton's theory that no, actually it's very, very low magnitude, kind of not very intense, but long-acting processes that actually do most of the work to shape the Earth's surface. With these three ideas in mind, that is superposition, original horizontality, and uniformitarianism, geologists apply those principles to something called relative dating. Relative dating is the idea that you can essentially interpret rock strata or interpret rock sections, basically large structures, large vertical and horizontal assemblages of rock. You can interpret those to tell the order of formation, the processes that happened, how long processes were happening, what their intensity is. Pardon me. In a relative sense. Now, that's in contrast to something called absolute dating, which is actually assigning a calendar age or a number of years in the past to either process, event, or rock formation. Relative dating merely is concerned with figuring out which layers came first relative to other layers. And relative dating uses a couple different, again, fairly intuitive concepts. And one is the principle of cross-cutting relationships. That is that younger features or younger rock will cut through older rock. That if you have two masses of rock and one is cutting across another, that the one that was cut across has to be there first before that one that is doing the cutting can show up. So in one of Hutton's early sketches of some of the geology up in northern Scotland, you see these layers of strata here going diagonally down, dipping to the left. And this body here, some sort of an igneous intrusion probably, cuts across some of these layers. So using the principle of cross-cutting relationships, one would necessarily figure out, and this again is probably pretty obvious to most of you, that this layer, this intrusive body, is younger than any of these layers that it cuts across. These layers that it cuts across have to have been there before that body came through, else it wouldn't have anything to come through. Another notion is called the principle of inclusions, and that is that pieces of rock, if they're included or contained within another rock, those pieces have to have been there before the material that surrounds them. So in this sketch, also by Hutton, or one of Hutton's illustrators, we have some probably metamorphic strata kind of going across, who knows what it is, but there's this intrusive body coming through. And here we have what's called an inclusion. That is a chunk of the rock of what's called the host rock, or the rock that was there before. This rock is surrounded by inclusion material, igneous, most likely, and therefore this inclusion needs to be older than the material that surrounds it. That's the principle of inclusion. We'll see a couple more examples of this in this lecture as we go on. And then there's something called the principle of unconformities. Unconformities are really, really important to geologists and historical geologists in particular. They represent gaps in geologic time. They represent gaps in deposition. It's when deposition stops, erosion occurs, and then deposition resumes. But what happens there is material has been removed. Material that tells the story of that area has been removed. Up here, this picture is just of some of the famous type sections that Hutton worked on in northern Scotland. Shows some extreme folding. And the Grand Canyon is an example of an area that has lots of really, really interesting geology, both because it spans, it's just a huge expanse of geologic time, but also because it shows lots of the features that geologists use to interpret Earth history, and that is unconformities, inclusions, intrusions, things like that, cross-cutting relationships. One of the first geologists, I think it was in the 1860s, 1870s, John Wesley Powell, was a Civil War hero who was also a geologist, and took a famous expedition down the Colorado River where he made an incredible number of maps and side expeditions up into the canyon to collect rock materials, and was one of the first to really document both the kind of foundational concepts of sedimentary stratigraphy in the western U.S., but as well as defining and documenting the Grand Canyon in particular. The Grand Canyon, and this sketch doesn't really show the concepts of cross-cutting, unconformities, or inclusions, but it does show superposition and original horizontality. What we have down here in the bottom is the Supai group. It's a layer of sandstone, siltstone, and shale, quite old. And as we go up, we have these different layers that were all laid down horizontally over time and have eroded differently. The Colorado River has cut down through, exposing this long section of geologic material that goes from limestone all the way down into the Supai group. We'll see a couple cross sections in a second that really kind of break this out. This figure, or this graphic, really shows cross-cutting relationships very, very well. It also shows how inclusions or intrusions can be used to look at the evolution of a geologic structure or geologic formations. Cross-cutting relationships don't necessarily need to be involve rocks. It doesn't need to necessarily involve, say, igneous intrusions cross-cutting over layers of sandstone, but it can also use, or geologists can utilize things like faulting to figure out the relative age of tectonic or earthquake activity, seismic activity. Here we have a situation where we have this yellow sandstone layer overlaying the, it's probably this red typically represents a silt or a shale. This brick kind of blocky texture oftentimes in geologic diagrams represents limestone or carbonate. We're down into probably a type of sandstone as well. Gray is often shale material in contrast to kind of a clayey mudstone. Anyway, what we have here is let's focus on the layer of sandstone, this yellow layer of sandstone, which we can see extends up above here. It does not connect. It's been split apart. It's been moved. And the thing that is cutting across it is this fault. But you'll notice that the fault does not extend through this layer of conglomerate. And so from an evolutionary perspective, from a geologic evolutionary perspective, what we have here is a situation where we can define in relative order of occurrence is we can say that, well, this kind of green mottled layer was laid down first. Remember, law of superposition, things on the bottom are older than things moving upwards. It was laid down horizontally, so the law of, or principle of original horizontality. So we have this overlain by the limestone, overlain by the red mudstone, overlain by the, I'll use my pointer, the yellow sandstone, overlain by, we're going to call this a shale bed. It's cut by this fault. Well, over the shale we have a layer of conglomerate. The conglomerate is not cut by the fault. So in an order of evolution we have green, limestone, mudstone, sandstone, shale, we'll call it. Then the fault occurred, so this area was impacted by some sort of seismicity. And then after that seismicity is when the conglomerate and the next layer of limestone and the next layer of shale were laid down. Now over here we have this dike that cross-cuts over all of these layers. So we can necessarily say this dike is younger than all layers. This dike, on the other hand, is younger than, and this sill is younger than the limestone, is younger than the shale, the sandstone, the mudstone, the limestone, and the, we'll call it, I don't even know what we should call it, the green rock down there. You can see how these different relationships, these different aspects of cross-cutting actually define the order in which geologic formations have appeared in a section. Relative dating, as mentioned before, uses inclusions. This is a better diagram of how inclusions can represent or can tell us which layer came first, or which section or which portion of a rock section came first. This is an example where we have an igneous intrusion that small bits of the what's called the host rock have chipped off and are included in that igneous intrusion. So we can necessarily state that, in fact, the igneous intrusion is younger, had to occur after this host rock was deposited and lithified, else there wouldn't be little chunks of the host rock present in the igneous intrusion. Now, unconformities, as I described before, are areas of missing kind of geologic time. They're areas of missing strata. They're caused by when deposition stops, erosion occurs, and then deposition resumes. When the deposition stops, we're no longer recording, we're no longer building up material that kind of tells the history of that location in space and time. When erosion occurs, what's actually happening is material that has recorded that geologic history is actually being removed. So geologists were to come by millions or thousands or hundreds of thousands of years later, they'd be walking up along that stratigraphic section looking at how that area evolved over time. All of a sudden, there's missing time. They can't read that story. It's almost like a section of a book, a chapter of a book has been removed. Deposition will resume on top of any erosional surface, and that resumes the recording or the writing of the story of that geologic location. Here's a kind of a graphical example of how an unconformity can occur. Here we have this host rock with an igneous intrusion occur in it. As erosion occurs, we see the erosion cuts down from the original surface up here, cuts down through, and eventually reaches and weathers away and transports some of that host rock as well as some of that igneous intrusion away. So that's the step of erosion occurring. And now when deposition resumes, we have deposition of horizontal strata following superposition, oldest first as getting progressively younger, moving on up. But we have this layer here, this surface here, is what's called a unconformity. And specifically, it's considered a nonconformity, which is one of the three types of unconformities: angular unconformity, disconformity, or nonconformity, that scientists have defined. Nonconformities are fairly straightforward to see if you have enough of a view of the section. Angular unconformities are also some of the most dramatic unconformities to see. The disconformities, where the layers, where you're in a sedimentary environment, where deposition has ceased, erosion occurs, and then deposition removes, sometimes you can't actually, that surface, that unconformity surface, or that non-conformable surface is really difficult to see. They can be pretty tricky. Just an example of how an angular unconformity occurs. And these are some examples, real-world examples of angular unconformities. Here's almost vertical strata from some sort of a past period of uplift and deformation, overlain by tilted strata, which were clearly not. Both of these layers of strata, both of these sections were laid down originally horizontal, with that principle of original horizontality. However, geologic forces over long periods of time have altered their orientation. Now here's how that can occur. This is just an example. We have the depositional stage where layers of conglomerate, limestone, mudstone, shale, sandstone are laid down. Layer number 5 is sandstone. You might have a deformation event where you have uplift and folding. So we see there are sedimentary strata, originally horizontal strata, are now folded and necessarily dip away. Remember, this is usually due to compressive forces. After that uplifting and folding occurs, normal processes of orogeny take over, and the second stage of orogenesis takes over, and you have erosion and downcutting. And so we're removing some of that material up here. You can see this is the original layers. Erosion has cut these surfaces away, and over long periods of time we can get more deposition occurring in. And you see this horizontal depositional, or this horizontal erosional surface overlain by now subsequently deposited horizontal sedimentary strata. It's pretty straightforward to see an angular unconformity in a large section like this, because it just pops right out of the eye that you have these angular beds that all of a sudden just end, that end abruptly in a horizontal layer of sedimentary strata. Now, if these layers weren't folded and faulted, or folded and deformed early on, and they remained horizontal, that erosional surface can be a little trickier to find. So this is an example of an angular unconformity. The Grand Canyon is an unconformity lover's dream. That is, if you really are into unconformities. Here we have a lot of we have examples of all three of the main types. We have angular unconformities in the deep Precambrian layers, where you have uplifted and deformed or strata dipping away from the center of the canyon, and those layers have been eroded and truncated, and horizontal lying sedimentary strata have been deposited down on top. So it's a clear angular unconformity. Remember, strata dipping away or dipping down, and a surface where they meet horizontal strata, or at least strata of a different orientation. Now, a nonconformity is where you have sedimentary deposition on top of a igneous or metamorphic eroded surface. And here we have the Vishnu schist, which forms the kind of the bottom of the canyon. Again, it's a metamorphosed, a large metamorphosed body with a granite intrusion that outcrops in the canyon walls. But this surface right here is a surface of erosion on that metamorphic area below, and the sedimentary area above. Now, the trickiest one of all are the two disconformities that are shown on this schematic. You can see that in the limestone, beneath the Muav limestone, above the Muav limestone and below the Redwall limestone, this is two rocks that are very, very, very similar in nature. But geologists have been able to discern right along this surface that an erosion, deposition stopped at one point, erosion took place, and then deposition removed. To the untrained eye, this could be a really, really tricky surface to detect, and it's possible to interpret going up section to look at this length of rock as being one continuous depositional sequence, when in fact nobody really knows what happened in this gap. And if that gap lasted a long time, hundreds of thousands to millions of years, that's a lot of geologic history that's been eroded away. Another disconformity above the Redwall limestone between the Supai and the limestone. The Supai is a shale mudstone group. Again, it's probably an easier disconformity to see because it is between two distinct layers. One is a really cliff-forming layer, and one is a slope-forming layer. But that's a nuance. But there's clearly a change in lithology at this point, and so scientists would be particularly keen on characterizing that surface exactly. What you can see here is that the Grand Canyon really spans a ginormous, which is not really a word, but a gigantic amount of time. Goes all the way from the Precambrian to 0.5 billion years ago, 540 million years ago, to the Permian, which is 250 million years. So we have 250 million years of depositional history, or almost 300 million years of depositional history recorded here in one location. This is a schematic or a drawing in your book that kind of walks you through all these relationships, all these tools for interpreting geologic evolution of a region. Shows the events that happen in the order in which they occur to generate this final structure. Relatively complicated structure. Here we have a geologic section that has intrusive dikes. It has instances of inclusions, both near the top, near the sandstone layer, and near a shale layer. It has horizontal strata meeting angular oriented strata. So it's got angular unconformities, it's got cross-cutting relationships, and it has superposition. So starting from the beginning, we have the basic depositional environment where rock layers A, B, C, and E are deposited in that order based on the law of superposition. Older things on the bottom, younger at the top. Diagram 2 shows that uplift occurs and a sill layer, layer D, intrudes. And the reason we know sill layer D intrudes is that you can see there are inclusions, both coming from sandstone E as well as shale C. Those inclusions are incorporated into the intrusion, layer D, and so that it is definitively younger than both E and C. Section 3 shows the next step, which is the intrusion of dike F, which cuts across all layers A, B, C, D, and E. Now, it does not cut across layers up here G, H, and I, so we know this had to have happened before these layers were laid down. This is the geologic schematic of that intrusion. The tilting and erosion, or the deformation and folding of this block, or this section, had to occur next, and we know that because layers of rock were deposited on top of it horizontally in the next block. Now, in fact, it may be easier to go through this, or I urge you at least go through this diagram forwards, from going from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the end, but also go backwards through it and see how each layer removing each layer kind of reveals what happened before. In the next step, in step 5, we see horizontal beds, erosion occur because we have that erosional surface. And after that erosion ends and deposition resumes, we have G, H, I, J, and K beds are laid down horizontally and consistent with superposition, which then evolves into block 6, where we see erosion of that upper layer of K, which is the superficial or surface at the present, or at least at the last state of time of this diagram. Correlation is the geologic concept that geologists use to develop and constrain more complete geologic histories of a region. That geologic history is both depositional and erosional, and you can use correlation, or stratigraphic correlation, to look at large areas of the Earth's surface and at depth, to kind of connect the dots across wide areas. Fossils that are unique to those beds or unique to those strata can be really, really helpful as scientists do stratigraphic correlation. But this example basically shows a long section of geologic time from the Precambrian to the Tertiary, which covers let's see, 540. Well, actually, in the Precambrian, we're up to basically about 1 million, on up to 65 million years ago, right up here at the top. Or I'm sorry, right here, about 65 million years. And this is about 2.6 million years. So a lot of time, from about a quarter of the way back to the beginning of the Earth to essentially the present day, and in a way, 2.6 million years ago is a real small amount of time, geologically speaking, but obviously it's huge in the human context. But this spans a huge chunk of Earth history right now. And what it's showing is that from areas across the western U.S. of the Grand Canyon, they don't have a horizontal scale here, but Grand Canyon to Zion to Bryce, which is shown in this map from Grand Canyon here to to Bryce to Zion, which isn't a straight line, but it basically shows the rock strata, each different layer, and you can make connections. So this section here is the Grand Canyon section that we looked at earlier, with the Vishnu schist down in the Precambrian, all the way up to the Kaibab limestone and the Monocapi Formation, which is a shale bed. Over at Zion, where we see this river cutting down into the strata there and exposing the layers of strata, we have a whole different section of geologic units, but there is some overlap. You can see the Kaibab and the Moenkopi Formation are both represented here in Zion. And so we're able to connect them, or geologists are able to connect them in time and space over here to the Grand Canyon section. And moving further up, you've got Navajo sandstone and the Carmel Formation in Zion, and over here in Bryce Canyon, further away, you've got those basic layers down at the very bottom of that section, the Navajo and the Carmel, going up through the Dakota sandstone, which is a relatively famous one, all the way up into the Wasatch, which exist all the way through the northern western U.S. So what geologists have done here is taken three different areas: the Grand Canyon River Cut, the Zion River Cut, and the Bryce Canyon exposure, and created a stratigraphic or a geologic history that spans much more than each of those places do individually, and connects those geologic layers over space and time. Now, fossils, as I mentioned, can be really, really useful in connecting those dots. So, sandstones oftentimes appear fairly similar. There are geochemical methods for, let's step back here. There are geochemical methods for figuring out if this limestone is in fact the same as this limestone that's hundreds of miles away, and whether this sandstone is the same as this sandstone that's hundreds of miles away but only exposed in two places. But a real easy way of doing it is if you find the same exact fossils in one and the other, and or only, I should say, if those fossils are relatively unique, relatively well constrained in geologic time. That is, they don't occur over long periods of geologic time, but they are geographically diverse. That is, they existed at their when they were extant. They existed over long periods or wide areas of the Earth's surface. That means that when an area here is deposited, the fossils that might be deposited in this, say, Kaibab limestone here would be the same. Sorry, this Kaibab limestone here would be the same fossils that were deposited at the same time over here at this section of the Kaibab limestone. You see, geologists can't see. If there's a geologist on the surface here, they can't actually see beneath the surface to see if this limestone right here is actually connected to this limestone up here. But if they find the same fossils in there and there, then it gives more support to the idea that they are. So fossils oftentimes go hand in hand with stratigraphy. So a lot of paleostratigraphers or sedimentologists and stratigraphers often have a bit of paleontology background, and vice versa. Different kinds of fossils exist. There's lots of different types of fossils, and they all yield fairly interesting information, some of it quite unique. The basic categories of fossilization are petrification, or making petrified fossils, which is a kind of a vernacular term for something that geologists call replacement, and that is that the cell material of an organism, whether it's a plant organism or a respiring organism that is not a plant from the kingdom Animalia, is removed and replaced with mineral matter. Usually groundwater that's percolating through will have higher concentrations or be saturated or supersaturated with respect to different minerals. And as that water sits in these cells of an organism after it dies and is buried, eventually those minerals will precipitate out and replace the cell walls that are made out of relatively labile organic carbon. That means relatively easy to degrade organic carbon, and replace them with more resilient refractory minerals. So petrification is one. Oftentimes people think of petrified wood or trees as one thing, and that's a good example. That's an example of a petrified, I guess, tree. You can see the structure of the bark on the outside. If you look closely, you'd probably see rings. Molds and casts are two types of fossils that most people probably think of when they think of fossils. A mold is occurs when an organism, usually with hard parts, a shell or hard parts of some sort, bones, is buried and then dissolved by underground water. So when that hard part is buried and surrounded by sediment, and that sediment is lithified or hardened into rock, sometimes the material that's inside that's creating that fossil is more soluble in water. Maybe is made of calcium carbonate or hydroxyl apatite, bone mineral, and will dissolve away in water, leaving an empty space. That's what a mold is. A cast is when a mold that is empty is filled with mineral matter. So it may be that finer grained particulate matter filters through that same area and fills in the cavity, hardens and lithifies into rock, and there you have basically a cast or a substituted version of the original structure that is more geologically resilient. Carbonization and encasement are two other types of fossilization. This example up here is where the organic carbon matter in an organism is preserved in usually really fine-grained sediments, shales, mudstones, things like that. Here's a similar example of carbonization where you're just left with kind of an imprint, not a very three-dimensional imprint, but more of a kind of a almost like a batik or print that you would make in an art class. Encasement is also incredibly rare. Only happens in places where organisms, usually insects, are moving through areas where there's sap, that is moving through trees. Sap, if organisms get trapped in sap over long periods of geologic time, that sap can actually harden into something called amber. And sometimes you'll find preserved insects, beautifully and incredibly well preserved insects inside amber. And scientists can get some really amazing information, both morphological information about those insects as well as chemical information, biochemical information about those organisms. And those are basically the major types of what most people consider to be fossils. That is, pieces or very accurate representations or recreations of the organisms themselves that are fossilized. But there's a significant and very important other type of fossil, and that's called the trace fossil. Trace fossils aren't actually preserved remains of previously living organisms. Trace fossils are instead preserved evidence for how organisms lived. So they may be footprint tracks that are preserved in mud, or burrows, gastroliths, stones that are found in some organism's stomach. One of my favorite types of trace fossils is called a coprolite, and this is an example of a coprolite over here. Take a look at that and just let your mind wander. What do you think that is? It's now rock. It would be not a problem to pick it up and hold it in your hand, and you could even put it on your bookshelf, carry it around in your book bag if you had it. If you're thinking that, yeah, this is the fossilized remains of what an organism excreted due to their metabolism, you're right. A coprolite is basically fossilized waste matter from organisms, and scientists can, if they find these, they can study them, and you have a great picture or great information on what an organism ate, how they processed what they ate, their metabolism, and their biochemistry. It's a fantastic field of study, and you don't have to wear gloves. You don't have to worry about smells or anything like that. These are thousands to millions to billions, well, thousands to millions of years old. Fossil correlation and stratigraphic correlation using index fossils is shown here. I referred to it a little bit or 2 slides ago. And what it basically is using fossils that occur both in short spans of geologic time. Over here, the age ranges of some fossil groups, you can see that, for example, ferns span a pretty long range of time. Mollusks, even larger. Trilobites, we'll get to these in the next chapter, relatively short period of time. Look at these echinoderms, echinoids, starfish, really long, and brachiopods for the longest. These maple leaves, or whatever the tree that is that's producing those leaves, relatively short, as well as this dinosaur fossil. So we can see here in this rock unit A, I'll go back, in this rock unit A, the pink rock unit A, the fossils that would occur only in this pink unit A. Of all of these fossils, well, trilobites would not occur in pink unit A. They weren't around then. Mollusks, ferns, echinoderms, and brachiopods would all occur in this, could all occur in this pink unit A. But only these leaves and these dinosaurs would occur in this pink unit A at the same time. These are the only two fossils that could constrain to this geologic period of, well, that constrain this layer to exactly this time, because fossils, this maple leaf, we'll call it, wasn't around before this point, and it existed here, and this dinosaur fossil was around until the end of this point. So when these two overlap, you know you're constrained into this time range. So the fact that this rock unit A has both this maple leaf and this dinosaur fossil means that this rock unit has to be from this age, whatever that age happens to be. Now, in a similar fashion, if we look down here at rock unit B, this rock unit B contains trilobites, ferns, brachiopods, mollusks, and starfish, or echinoderms, or echinoids. Now, if we look and find which of these, how do we constrain the age range of this bed? Well, if we look at over here at our fossil arrangement, or our fossil ranges, we'll find that, well, if it has a trilobite, it has to be this age or older. Okay, because trilobites ended there. But we also see, well, let's see, brachiopods. Let's look at brachiopods. Does brachiopods tell us anything? Well, brachiopods occurred from here, same as trilobites, all the way up. No, that doesn't give us very much information at all. It could be any age from here to here if it has a brachiopod. Same goes for the starfish fossils, and for the most part, same goes for the mollusks. But if we look at the fern, we notice that the fern starts to appear here in geologic time all the way up to the youngest strata. But where that fern and the trilobite overlap is constrained to this small little area right here. So using fossil correlation, we can determine that this layer, rock unit B, has to be somewhere in this age of geologic time. So it's using patterns of fossil occurrence and fossil existence to match up rock strata layers over wide distances. Now, it's important for index fossils, and these are this trilobite and the fern and the maple leaf and the dinosaur are examples, could be examples of index fossils in that they have relatively short geologic time spans, relatively short relative to other fossils. And if they're, as long as they're widespread geographically and can occur and can be found over wide ranges of the Earth's surface when they were alive, then they'd be really useful. Because if they weren't found over wide ranges geographically, then you might find it in one layer and another layer that was deposited contemporaneously or at the same time, hundreds and hundreds of miles away, might not have those same fossils in it if that organism didn't live in that location too. So it is important to have fossils. Or have index fossils both constrain time and be widely distributed. Now, we've been talking mostly about relative dating for the most part here up until now, and index fossils do give some sense of absolute age because they are oftentimes known to occur, or at least over the last 100, 200 years of geologic research, scientists have determined that certain index fossils represent certain periods of time, and you can use them to a degree to give you absolute ages, that is, calendar ages. 2.5 million years ago, 253 million years ago, 1.4 billion years ago, that kind of thing. Although you can't really go back to 1.4 billion years, but we'll talk about that in the next chapter. The other way of determining the absolute age of rocks is to use something called radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is based on the principle of or the physical process of radioactivity or radioactive decay. Radioactive decay is the spontaneous breaking apart of atomic nuclei. Basically, there are elements in the periodic table that will spontaneously self-destruct by losing energetic particles. And in radioactive decay, scientists use two terms, the parent and the daughter, to describe different stages of that decay. A parent isotope is an isotope or an element with a specific unique number of neutrons and protons that is the kind of the starting point for a radioactive decay reaction. And daughter products or daughter product are the results of those decay processes. Radioactive decay can occur through three different types of physical process. One is called an alpha emission. That's where pairs of protons and neutrons will be expelled from the nucleus. And what that happens is the mass of the isotope goes down by 4 because both neutrons and protons have atomic masses of 1 or thereabouts. But the atomic number, which is really the number of protons, goes down by 2. And this here chart shows these relationships. The other common type of radioactive decay process is called a beta emission. And a beta emission is where an electron is emitted. And when an electron is emitted, remember, electrons are negatively charged. So the atomic number goes up, but the mass number doesn't change at all because protons and neutrons are not being lost. And a third type of decay mechanism is electron capture, and that's where an electron is kind of adsorbed or absorbed by an element. The atomic number drops by 1. The mass number, since electrons have no mass or negligible mass, doesn't change at all. This graphic over here illustrates kind of the process, how atomic masses and atomic numbers change with the different kinds of emissions. Alpha emissions are in red, beta emissions in blue. Alpha emission, if you're starting in the uranium lead series, it's called, because the parent isotope is uranium-238. The ultimate daughter product is lead-206. But in the uranium-238 series, the first decay step is an alpha emission, where the atomic mass drops by 4, whereas the atomic number drops by 2. The next step in the uranium series are two betas are emitted to get to U-234, and then we go down with a series of alpha emissions all the way to lead-214, then we alternate between betas and alpha particles emitting to get to lead-206. These processes occur the same way all the time. Scientists have been studying this for 80, 90 years and have not or are in extremely good agreement that both the principles of radioactive decay are absolutely correct, or the theory behind it is correct, and that the occurrence or the way it happens is uniform through space and time. That is, the uranium-238 element will decay to lead-206 over a known at a known rate, and that there is nothing that changes that rate. There's no known processes that actually change that rate. Now, there's some very recent research. In fact, it was published, I believe, in the late 2013, that did show that some rates of radioactive decay for some of the really, really short-lived isotopes, the chlorine-26, I think it's 26, the chlorine series, and maybe even the, I wish, I don't know the other series, but these are really, really short-lived series with half-lives on the order of days. That changes in the sunspot cycle, basically, will create slight changes in the rate of radioactive decay. However, it's been suggested that by people who don't really understand or actually haven't really read the research, that this proves that radioactive decay is not the same through geologic time, when in fact these observations that are just newly reported, what they actually show is that the rate of change, or the rate of variability in or the variability shown, the variability observed in the rate of radioactive decay in these short-lived isotope series, along with the sunspot cycle, are in fact so small, the variations are so small, that they don't appreciably affect the half-life of these series, and they do not call into question, at any stretch of the imagination, they do not call into question the use of radiometric dating for purposes of dating Earth materials into the Precambrian and Archean, into the billions of years. They just don't have any effect. So it's more academic than anything. Radioactive decay occurs using, scientists utilize the principle of what's called a half-life to describe radioactive decay and to capitalize on it as a dating technique. The half-life is basically can be defined as the amount of time it takes for 1/2 of a radioactive body to decay. If you have a mass of uranium-238 and you let it sit for, gosh, I can't remember right now, we'll see in a second, whatever the amount of time it is that its half-life, then at the end of its one half-life, half of that uranium-238 will have converted to lead-206 in that series. Now, if you go another block of that half-life time, then you're left with, if you start at 100% and you wait for one half-life, then you have 50% of your atoms left. This is represented by 100 parent isotope element molecules, 100 parent atoms. Over the half-life, which is the amount for half of those to decay to the daughter product, you have this graphic here where you have 50 blue parent atoms and 50 red daughter atoms. The next half-life, the same amount of time, so we're at one half-life here, then for the next half-life, 2 half-lives, you've gone from 50% to half of that, which is 25% of the original material. So you have 25 red parent atoms and 75 blue daughter atoms. Moving on to the next half-life. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Next half-life was 3 half-lives. At 3 half-lives, we're not going to 150% loss. What we do go is we go from half of what was at the previous half-life. So we had 25 atoms of parent, 75 of daughter. One more half-life, we're left with 13 or 12.5 atoms of parent and 88.5 or 87.5 atoms of daughter product. So that's how half-lives work. Eventually you get to essentially no parent left, but it takes a very, very, very long time. Radiometric dating requires a closed system. That is, the daughter products cannot be removed. So there are some systems where, some radioactive decay series where some of the daughter products, especially kind of midway through, and uranium is one of them, where radon-226 is actually a gas. And so if the rock that has the uranium in it is decaying, and a scientist finds that rock and wants to measure the amount of uranium that it has in it, right here, and the amount of lead that it has in it, to make a calculation over here about how many half-lives it's gone through, they have to be sure that at no point in that rock's history did the radon gas, that is that middle point, did that radon gas have a chance to escape before decaying to the next stage of in the decay series. So a closed system is a system where daughter products are not removed, because fundamental to the radiometric dating technique is the ability to measure the quantity of parent and the quantity of daughter. And the relationship between those two, or the proportion between those two, is defined, is dependent on the number of half-lives that have occurred between when that parent was originally 100% and the point in time in which it was sampled and analyzed. If some of that daughter material is removed in an open system type of situation, then the scientists would not be able to measure accurately the quantity of daughter, and would not be able to establish that proportionality, and would not be able to establish that the half-life, or the number of half-lives that have occurred. Radiometric dating involves some pretty complex processes of sample preparation, cleaning, and analysis. A lot of scientists pursue it, and there are certain scientists who are very, very, very good at it. It takes a lot of time, effort, and academic and scientific resources to produce these dates, and they do yield actual numerical dates, or not really calendar dates, but numerical dates. That is a quantified and defined age of formation for different rock layers, oftentimes with an uncertainty estimate, that is a plus or minus number that, for an example, if you're measuring a rock of granite from, the Tertiary, you might come up with a age of 40 million years plus or minus 100,000 years, and that's basically giving a sense that you can't ever nail anything down exactly, but the finer that uncertainty or the smaller that uncertainty is, gives a sense of the precision of that measurement, how accurate how precise it is, how repeatable that is. So which decay series do scientists use? A lot of people think of radiometric dating as radiocarbon dating or carbon-14 dating. Well, different decay series, different isotope series have different half-lives. Uranium-238, which goes to lead-206, has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. It's great for measuring ages in the tens to hundreds of the tens of billions of years. So kind of before even the Earth formed, but it's also can be pretty useful for measuring Archean and Hadean rocks, which are before the Precambrian, that are 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion years old. The uranium-235 to lead-207 series, which is part of that U-238 series, has a half-life of 700 million years. It's great for measuring rocks in that kind of Precambrian to Cambrian age. So lead-210 series is a short-lived isotope, great for measuring tens to hundreds of years. Carbon-14 is great for hundreds to thousands of years. Uranium-thorium is really good in the thousands of years. The potassium-argon system, half-life of 1.3 billion years, is excellent for thousands to millions of years ages. And the rubidium-strontium system, look at this, half-life of 47 billion years. This decays very, very slowly. It's great for millions to billions of years age determinations. Now, that gives a sense of which decay series is appropriate depending on the time scale that one would be looking at. But scientists also have to take into account the presence of these isotopes in the rocks that they're using. Now some rocks, volcanic rocks, aren't going to contain much carbon, so it would be quite difficult, if any carbon. Scientists it wouldn't be appropriate to try to date a recent volcanic eruption lava flow using carbon-14 dating. Whereas, rocks that are, 500 million years old don't have much carbon in them, if any at all, just because there wasn't a whole lot of life around on the surface of the Earth at that point in time, and carbon primarily comes from organic life forms. And the carbon-14 system there wouldn't be any carbon or radiocarbon left with that age because of the half-life of radiocarbon. So scientists have to pick not only based on the time scale of their or the half-lives of their decay series, but also whether those elements or isotopes will even exist in the rocks that they're trying to calculate dates on. Carbon-14 is an interesting one because its half-life is 5,700 years, and it is used to date very recent events. So anthropologists, archaeologists, geologists who study the Holocene and the Pleistocene use it quite a bit, and it's produced naturally. It kind of is continuously refreshed in the atmosphere, and because it's carbon, it is incorporated by living things. Living things, almost by definition, incorporate carbon as a source of energy, and so carbon-14, which is the only radiometric or radioactive isotope of carbon, which is generated naturally in the atmosphere, combines with oxygen to form carbon dioxide, which is used by plants in photosynthesis, is naturally kind of and continuously introduced into the biosphere. when organisms die, they no longer take up newly fresh carbon-14 through the CO2 that they're using for photosynthesis, and that carbon-14 starts to decay naturally by beta emission. So what that means is that a carbon-14 measure of carbon-14 in a sample relative to actually carbon-13 and carbon-12 can provide an age of death for any organism that is within 10 to 20 half-lives of the carbon-14 decay series. The way this is often utilized by Earth system scientists or Earth historians is through trees. Trees are organisms that incorporate carbon dioxide into their or use carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. The carbon that they use in photosynthesis is actually incorporated into their cell walls and the physical matter that makes up the tree. And trees are fairly unique. Well, not fairly unique, but interesting in that they grow outward from a center with well-defined bands that represent periods of growth. And so scientists can take what's shown up here, which is a core, a small tube, basically a straw-sized tube of tree material going all the way into the middle, and can slice that into small little parts and can use the amount of carbon-14 relative to the non-radioactive carbon in the material to generate an age for the material. Now, living trees are pretty easy because if you just take that core, you're counting from the outside. If you're counting the rings from the outside, that outside ring is basically the most modern material, and you can count the number of rings and get the age of the tree. But fossilized or cores, trees that have been long dead, that are buried either in sediments or accumulated in other geologic kind of depositional environments where you don't know when the tree died, you can take these cores and figure out both the age of formation as well as the age of death would be the outside ring. But one can also find information about, say, hydrology, the hydrologic cycle, the water balance of the region, precipitation versus drought, areas of flood or water excess versus water stress. Scientists use these cores to look for other climatological patterns like temperature variations, ecological stress, and whatnot. Lastly, in Chapter 11, the book introduces what's called the geologic timescale. The geologic timescale is essentially a timeline of the Earth divided up into different types of units. The biggest units in the geologic timescale are eons, and there are basically eons are these large scales of time. We have the Precambrian eon, which is really the Hadean and the Archean, and the Proterozoic. Modern or kind of the most is known about the Phanerozoic eon, which you can see only encompasses 1/9 of geologic time if one considers the Earth is 4 to 4.5 billion years old. The beginning of the Phanerozoic started 542 million years ago. The next finer subdivision are called eras, and within eras, which are the major eras are especially in the far back periods of Archean and Proterozoic time. Basically talk about Paleo, which is ancient, which is a prefix that means ancient. Meso typically means middle, and Neo means new. So in the Proterozoic eon, you have the Paleoproterozoic, which is the oldest Proterozoic, the Mesoproterozoic, which is the middle Proterozoic, and the Neoproterozoic, which is the new Proterozoic. Now, in the Phanerozoic period of Phanerozoic eon, you have the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, and this is the eon of life, basically. This dividing line between the Phanerozoic and the Precambrian is when nobody knows exactly when life originated on Earth, but this is where the fossil record really starts to bloom. You can see this space up here in the Cenozoic and the Mesozoic and the Paleozoic is really blown up into other pretty significant distinctions of periods and epochs that are smaller zones or smaller subsystems of the time scale. We will be going in Chapter 12 into each of these regions or each of these time bins separately. First, we'll be looking at the Precambrian, talking about the evolution of the Earth from its earliest stages, and we'll get all the way back up to the Cenozoic, the age of modern life. But what's interesting about the geologic timescale, what I want you to think kind of deeply about, is think about how much information geologists have as it relates to how far back in time the information comes from. So, putting it another way, do you think that geologists, it's easier to figure out the history of the Earth, say during the Holocene and the Pleistocene, which are only 10,000 years ago to 2.6 million years ago, pretty recent stuff. Let's go back to, say, the Triassic and the Permian, 250 million years ago. Do you think there's a lot of geologic information left on the surface or at depth that geologists can interpret relative to the Holocene and the Pleistocene, or do you think the Holocene and Pleistocene have much more information, or can be seen much more easily in the geologic record? Well, if you're thinking that the further back you go, the harder it is to tell the story, you're absolutely right. So as you go further back in time, let's go down to the Cambrian, 500 million years ago. There's not lots of material left on the Earth's surface that shows us what was happening there. There's not many pages left of that story. And then let's go back past the Cambrian into the Precambrian, into the Proterozoic, 500 to 2.5 billion years ago in that Proterozoic era or eon. That's a long time ago. There's not much material left there, even less than in the Cambrian. And then let's go back to the Archean and then the Hadean. There's there's really no material left from the Hadean. And the Archean is almost 4 billion years old. You can imagine how few rocks on the surface of the Earth vis-a-vis, otherwise you can think of rocks as pages to the story of the Earth, pages to that book. How few pages there are of that book, of the Earth story, that go back that far to 4 billion to 3 billion to 2.5 billion years old. So the geologic timescale is not equally represented in the rock record. The information that we have from the Precambrian and beyond is a lot sparser. There's a lot of holes relative to the information that we have from the Cenozoic, say the most recent era. All right, so that's it for chapter 11. We'll move on to chapter 12 next, and in chapter 12 we'll be looking at the specific evolutionary history or geologic evolutionary history of the Earth. Hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you in the next lecture.